So now we're talking about the text that I mentioned by Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman in his disputation with Pablo Cristiani, where he says the phrase כמו שיעמוד הגמון אחד ויעשה סרמון ואחד השומעים ישר בעיניו וכתבו והסרמון הזה מי שיאמין בו יאמין ומי שלא אין דבר. It's like it doesn't matter if you don't believe in it. And he says you only accept that which makes sense. So he's very particular in the way of delivery. He says first you have the person who delivers the sermon and then the listeners writes it down. So in that description, it's almost stated that the sermon was not meant to be written down. It is not a text that has to be delivered for a generation to come, because it deals with a particular situation in a particular time and place. So the bishop let's say the rabbi delivers the sermon. He talks to his listeners. He talks about things that everybody's aware of. And he doesn't have to specify them because they are part of the social life and all the issues that are on the listeners' minds. And the rabbi makes his comments. And like I said, sometimes we would use metaphor, and everybody would be clear. They know what the metaphors are because they know who are we talking about. And it's not meant to be written down, because once it's written down, you're taking a message that was meant for one generation and you pass it on to future generations. Take, for example, let's think about that to see both parts of this equation. Let's say someone who has no idea of the symbolism of that is used when you talk about states and nations and political entities, and he comes upon an article from the let's say the 1914 First World War that describes the German eagle spreading its talons and wings all over Europe, and and clutching that land in its grip. That person would say, this is ridiculous. You don't have such a big animal, right? Such a big eagle that could do that. But people know that's a metaphor. So that's one side of it, like to understand that we are talking about in the Midrash metaphors and ideas that are not to be taken literally. The other thing is, if a rabbi living under Nazi Germany makes a statement that says that you should oppose the government, right? You should oppose the evil laws, and you should go against them and undermine them, and maybe even kill and assassinate their representatives. And of course, he would say it very cautiously. No one should take this and apply it to people living in America or in any other country. That's a very particular statement to a very particular time. This is what the Ramban is talking about. The person who delivers the sermon does not want it to be handed down for generations to come. He wants it to be only delivered to his crowd at that moment. Writing it down is already a problem. Problem first, like Naama mentioned before, because there is a distortion of the original intention of the author. And the second problem is that we are making permanent something which was meant to be temporary. And there are plenty of examples of that in Midrash. Okay, so now this is important because when we talk about the development of halakha, and people think that Midrash Aggadah has no impact on halakha, but it's not true, because what people read in Aggadah eventually is transmitted into halakha. And remind me if we spoke about the anti-Zionist Midrash last week. Did I mention that? The idea of not climbing the wall, right? We spoke about that. Okay, so that's the extreme example of a Midrash that was not meant for generations, but was taken as such, and because of that created a distortion of the idea of what Jews should be like in exile. The belief that we should not oppose the nations, we should not try to bring the Geulah before its time, and so on, caused the people start believing that this is how we have to live. And eventually, when there was a chance to go to Eretz Israel, when the Zionist movement started, they denied it. They reneged. Even today, there are large portions of the Jewish Orthodox world who believe that the establishment of the state of Israel was an act of defiance against God, based on that line of the Midrash. This is ridiculous, preposterous, and tragic that this is what happened. So I want to look at another Midrash. But by the time I pull it up on the screen, if anyone has questions or comments on that, please feel free to ask.
I had a question about, there's something sort of rattling around in my head about this idea that the transmission of a sermon by a rabbi to their congregants,
okay,
being in a unique moment of presence where there is context, where there is historical relevance, where there is social, present moment circumstance. There's something in there about the comparison between things that were transmitted that were required to be written down in Torah versus, sort of ephemeral statements and ideas that need to be delivered to people, whether in Galut or out of Galut. But there's something in there about like the permanence of information given in Torah versus Midrash being really contextual and based on the present moment of the story. I can't seem to form it into words.
So is your question is whether there's a difference between the permanence of the message between Torah and Midrash. I would say that even this distinction even exists between the Torah and the Nevi'im, and even between certain parts of the Torah and other parts of the Torah. And then we have a serious problem there in terms of dogma. This is something that we discuss on our Monday classes with Rabbi Daniel Weissrab. It comes up a lot. The idea of dogma in Judaism it's really not a Jewish idea. The principles of faith, but taken as they are, one of them is Torah lo tishtane b'shum zman chas v'shalom. The Torah will never change. So when someone comes and asks the question about certain mitzvot of the Torah and ask, will they be relevant? Are they relevant today? Will they be relevant in the future? The Orthodox mentality is to reject this question right away. What do you mean? Of course, it is meant to be there forever, right? Because the Torah will never change. But we have to examine this very statement. What does it mean that the Torah will never change? When we say that the Torah will never change, it doesn't mean that we will always observe the Torah the way it is. And there are plenty of statements in even the Midrashic literature, Halacha and Aggadah, to support that. For example, there's one statement in the Talmud that says that in the future, all the sacrifices will cease to exist except for Korban Todah. So Korban Todah is a korban of thanksgiving that people usually bring with flour and grain, but animal sacrifices will stop. That the rabbis say that. So what do they mean? How can they say that with all the discussion of the sacrifices in the Torah? The answer is that when we're saying that the Torah will not change, it means that we believe that it will not happen in the future that a prophet will appear or that God will speak to us and say, remember the Torah that I gave you that you were following for thousands of years that was given in Sinai? All wrong. No, it should have been written differently. This will not happen, and this we could totally believe. But for God to come and say, what I told you 2,000 years ago was true back then, and the text should remain there, but you should not do it today. By that, we're not changing the Torah. But I have a feeling that even if God spoke to us today, even through a prophet, that would go through the whole process of certification as appears in the book of Devarim and the Talmud and Maimonides, if that prophet would say, you don't have to put tefillin anymore the way you did until now, the Orthodox community say, Sheker ata dover, you're a liar, God didn't speak to you, and maybe even stone him to death. And that is the thing that happened. You know, classic story, unfortunate story at the end of the book of Yirmiyah, after the assassination of Gedaliah ben Ahikam, the people come to Yirmiyah and say, we need to know whether we should stay here, here in Israel, or go to Egypt. Why would they want to go to Egypt? Because Gedaliah was the governor appointed by the king of Babylonia, by Nebuchadnezzar. And his assassination was an act of rebellion against Babel. So now the people said, maybe we should not stay in Eretz Israel. Maybe we should flee the country and go to Egypt. They tell Yirmiyahu that, and Yirmiyahu says, I'm not going to, forget it. I'm not going to answer your question. Why? Because you never listened to me. You tried to kill me. They threw me into the pit, into the quicksand, or whatever it was. No, I'm not going to talk to God. Do whatever you want. And they plead with him. They say, no, we promise. We'll listen to you. Whatever you say, we'll listen to you. And Yirmiyahu says, okay, I'll ask God. And he asks God. After 3 days, he comes back with an answer. God said, stay here. Everything will be fine. Don't go to Egypt. The people look at him and say, Sheker ata dover, lo diber elecha Elohim. You are a liar. God didn't speak to you. What are they saying? This is sort of the cognitive dissonance, right? Or the way you stick to a conspiracy theory. They say, of course, we would believe you if God had spoken to you, but God didn't speak to you. They find a way around it. But anyway, going back to your question, because I saw like I did a long detour. Even when you look at the Torah, we have to think about it when we say about the permanence of the message is I don't want to say subjective, but it's a fluid permanence, meaning it doesn't mean that we will do exactly the same things as described in the Torah, and the messages, all the message of the Torah will apply to all people in all generations, but rather that we understand the veracity of these messages in certain periods, and sometimes we reveal the hidden wisdom in layers as we go, as we ourselves evolve. It has to do whether it's sort of scientific truths or myths that are in the Torah. We discussed it in our classes on Bereshit. The Torah didn't mean to give us a scientific account of how the world was created. So does that make the story of Bereshit less valid? No, it's an amazing story. It has a message, and we need to know how to interpret it. It helped us. The fact that we know today that the world is between 14 to 15 billion years helps us understand the story of creation in a more symbolic way, where in the past we thought that we should take it literally. When we talk about halakha, same thing. There are certain parts of the Torah that we would say the halakha was, that is how the halakha was 2,000 years ago, and that is how it is today. For example, when the Torah say, Moznei tzedek, avnei tzedek, efat tzedek, vehin tzedek yelecha, your weights, measurements, and utensils for measuring either liquid or solid merchandise should be accurate and balanced. Or in other words, business ethics is a key component of being observant. This was true 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, and it is true today. But people forget it. But when the Torah says, Mechashefa lo tehayeh, you should not let a witch survive. So we have to understand this is read differently. The lo tehayeh doesn't mean assassinate or kill or execute witches, but rather don't let this practice survive in the land. You should root it out, because I think it's a logical conclusion for believing people. If you're, okay, people are both believers and logical, I should say. If you're logical and rational, you understand that witchcraft is impossible, right? It's not a thing. If it's not a thing, if there's no validity to witchcraft, how can the Torah demand execution for witches, right? It's not the Salem trials. It can't be that. So what the Torah is saying, and that's why we could discuss it, but there's a choice of words there. The Torah says, do not let this practice survive in the land. That's why in the time of King Saul, in Shaul HaMelech, there's still a Ba'alat Ov. People were not executed. They lived in hiding. And when he needs to find someone like that, he goes and he finds the person. So that is in the Torah. So and now you move from the Torah to the Nevi'im. In the Nevi'im, there are messages which are particular and messages which are universal, both in terms of time and space. When Yirmiyahu, for example, is being told, go and stand in the gates of the house of the temple and tell the people who come in, why are you coming here? This became a den of criminals. This is a particular message for the temple of the time, but it also carries a universal message to religious practice that goes awry, that becomes corrupt. On the other hand, when a prophet speaks about the idolatry erected by Yerovam in Dan and Beersheba in the north and the south of Israel, there's a particular message to the people at the time. So, and then there are prophecies delivered to Babylonia, to Assyria, to Tyre. So all these things are temporal. So why are the Jews that interpret all this literally? Because they want, that's a good question. People want to believe that the whole system is cohesive and monolithic. It's one unit. Because they think that when you forbid people to ask questions, your system is more secure. That I think that is it's a misconception. I think that the reality proves exactly the opposite. Because you don't allow asking questions, the whole system is flawed. And when people who grew up in the system, I know of a lot of people that call themselves Hozrim b'She'elah, even though it's not really a term, like people say, Lahzor b'Tshuvah is a redundant term. The word is Lashuv in Hebrew, or La'asot Teshuvah, to return. Lahzor b'Tshuvah is to return and returning. It's redundant. But people think that the word teshuvah means answer. So to return with an answer. So the opposite of that is to return with a question. So they call people who leave Judaism huzrim b'she'elah. But those people who abandon Judaism, for a lot of them, the reason is those people were brought up observant, believers, whatever. For them, the crucial moment comes when they realize that one piece of that huge structure that they were told was one solid unit, when they realize that one piece doesn't fit, everything comes falling down. I'll give you one example that has to do with the Midrashim that we spoke about now. I was going to show you a Midrash on Avraham and the Brit Milah, but I'll talk about another Midrash. And that's the story of Avraham being thrown into the furnace. We know the story, right? Avraham, if you join us on Kabbalat Shabbat, we sing that beautiful Ladino song, Cuando el rey Nimrod al campo salía, miraba en el cielo la estrellería, vido luz santa en la judería que había de nacer Avraham Avinu. When King Nimrod would go out to the field, and he would look up to the sky, to the constellation of the stars, he would see a bright light shining over the Jewish neighborhood. And that was the light of Avraham Avinu, which was about to be born. So first of all, there's an anachronism in the song. Nimrod cannot see a light over the Juderia, over the Jewish neighborhood. because there are no Jews yet. There's no such thing as Judea. So obviously, this is a song, by Spanish-speaking Jews who lived in Juderias in the Jewish neighborhoods all over Spain. But the core of the story is based on the Midrash that when Abraham was born, Nimrod, the king Nimrod, was the king of Babylonia, looked at the heavens, and the astrologers told him they saw two stars, one rising star, which was the star of Nimrod, and another star, which was about to collide with that star and bring it down. And they told him, this is the star of your nemesis, right? Which was Avraham Avinu. So Nimrod hunts for that baby, but he's being hidden by his mother in a cave. And then he goes out and he finds out about God because he looks at the sun and he says the sun is God. But then the sun disappears and the moon shows up and he says the moon is God, and then the sun again, and then he realizes neither is God. There's one entity above all of them. And then he goes around with this. He has this revelation when he's 3 years old, and he goes around and he preaches this belief in one God to the whole nation. And his father and brothers try to, hold him back, and they say, okay, you know what? You're not good as a preacher because you're preaching a different religion than ours. Maybe you should go and work in our family store. The Terah family had a souvenir store selling statues, idols, and Abraham is not doing very good at selling them. I'm shorting the story of just the fun version. Abraham, everyone who comes to buy an idol is convinced by Abraham that it's really foolish. Why would you bow down to something that was made today from clay? And eventually Abraham takes a stick and breaks all the idols. It's a beautiful story. It's a fun story, but not true. Never happened. He puts the stick in the hand of the biggest statue, and when his father comes and says, what happened here? He said, they were fighting over food, and this big guy took a stick and broke all the other idols. And his father said, that can't be, they can't move. And Abraham says, so why do you bow down to them? So this is a sort of dispute with paganism that is inserted into Abraham's mouth. And as a result, Nimrod throws Abraham into the furnace. And Abraham is saved and he survives. This whole story hinges on two statements in the Torah. One is the story of Nimrod, one verse about Nimrod that says, Nimrod was a hero in front of Hashem, which is read as Nimrod had a confrontation with Hashem. It's also based on the fact that Nimrod is similar to the word mered, rebellion in Hebrew. That's one element of the story. Yeah. Look at Naama's comment, yes, and also what Eduardo wrote. And the second element is that Hashem tells Avraham, Anochi Hashem Elohecha asher hotzeticha me'ur Kasdim. I took you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. So Ur in Hebrew could be understood as fire. So Ur Kasdim, the fire of the Chaldeans. So Avraham was thrown into the furnace. The problem is that we know that Ur of the Chaldeans was the metropolis, the main city of the Chaldean culture. So there's no fire there. No fire, no smoke. Right? So where did these stories come from? This something that we discussed about last week when we spoke about Midrash. It was needed. People wanted the rabbis to embellish the biblical stories because there was not enough meat there, right? You read the story about Avraham, and Hashem spoke to Avraham. Avraham was 75 years old, and people say, hey, Rabbi, tell us a little more. Who's Avraham? 75 years old. That's, the average of Biden and Trump running for president, and they're considered the oldest people running for presidency. How can you have a candidate to lead the Jewish people, 75-year-old, and you have no idea, of his past? So the rabbis created this past for him. It's beautiful, very nice. The problem is that it is marketed to children in schools and written in books like My Little Midrash Says, and the Midrash Says, and the Torah Anthology, and a million other books as fact. Just the other week, I was a couple of weeks ago when my daughter studied that in school. I said, it's not in the Chumash. I mean, and we said, everyone said, what? It is? No, it's not. It was like, so why am I mentioning all that? I know that this story, or it's a mission from the Torah, caused people to lose their faith. I know of one particular story. The retired judge Haim Ovadia is one of the greatest scholars in Israel of Jewish law. He wrote a book, 3-volume Jewish law, that I recommend to everyone as the introduction to the world of halacha. It's 3 thick volumes, or maybe 4 in English, that describe the halachic literature in detail. 2 of his sons are rabbis, and the 3rd son has went, as they say, off the derech. And I think it's Ari Elon. And I read the interview with Ari Elon about the reasons why he left Judaism. And he said that this Midrash was the key factor. He said at one point in his teenage life, or maybe a little later, he decided to go back to the Torah and search for the story of Abraham in the furnace and how he broke the idols. And he said, I searched back and forth throughout the parashiot of Lech Lecha and Vayera, and it's not there. And he said, well, they were lying to me. Who made it up? Where does it come from? It doesn't make sense. And for him, when this piece was removed, everything fell down. So that answered the question when you asked before, why do people insist of saying that the whole thing is one unit? Because they're afraid that if you break one piece, everything will come down. But it's misguided and it backfires, because people do find out that things don't fit, and then they abandon everything instead of realizing that there were certain things that were done at a time and place as needed and are not necessarily eternal or relevant to our culture today.
Well,